There is a particular kind of silence that fills a barn when the animals are gone. It is not the silence of peace or rest, not the silence of a quiet country evening after all the work is done and the farmer sits down to supper exhausted from the day's labors, not the silence of a barn in winter when the animals are sheltered. Inside and the world beyond is hushed with snow, but rather the silence of absence, of loss, of something essential having been removed and leaving behind only emptiness and echoes and the ghost of what once was. Imagine stepping into a vast structure, perhaps 100 feet long, 40 feet wide, with high ceilings designed to accommodate the volume and the movement of livestock that has echoed for decades with the constant and almost symphonic sounds of livestock going about their existence. There was the lowing of cattle, the deep resonant calls of animals expressing hunger or distress, or contentment, the bleating of sheep responding to each other and to the presence of their lambs, the distinctive calls of mothers recognizing their young, the grunting and squealing of pigs in their pens, the sounds of pigs rooting and moving and expressing themselves, the rustling and fluttering of chickens and birds moving through their cages and perches, the pecking sounds of birds engaged in their endless search for food, the sounds of hooves on concrete or on straw, the splash and drip of water as animals drink from troughs, the constant rustle of hay being moved and eaten and trampled, the sounds of farm equipment and machinery, the sound of the farmer's footsteps and voice, all of these sounds together creating a kind of audio landscape that was so constant and so familiar that a farmer would barely notice them consciously until they were gone. Sounds that would become almost part of the background of consciousness, part of the sensory environment that defined daily existence, and then to find the absence of these sounds almost unbearable, almost deafening in its completeness, almost suffocating in its suggestion of finality and loss and emptiness. This is the story of farmers across Europe and North America, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, who faced precisely this nightmare scenario in the years following 2001 and continuing through the following decades, when livestock diseases of unprecedented scale and virulence and transmissibility swept through herds and flocks with terrifying speed, when governments were forced to implement culling programs of unprecedented scale and brutality, programs that required the mass slaughter of millions upon millions of animals, animals that farmers had spent years or decades raising and caring for and depending upon for their livelihoods, animals that represented not just economic assets and not just production units, but relationships, complex relationships that had developed over years of daily care and interaction, connections to the land, ways of life that had sometimes existed essentially unchanged for centuries, traditions and knowledge and skills passed down from generation to generation within farming families. It is the story of how communities built around agricultural traditions and agricultural identity and agricultural labor faced the potential collapse of those traditions, how farmers who had never known any other life found themselves facing a future without animals, without herds and flocks, without the daily rhythms and routines that had defined their existence and given their lives structure and meaning and purpose, and how they struggled to find meaning and purpose and economic survival in the wake of this catastrophe, how they grieved and how they persisted, how they adapted and how they continued even when everything seemed lost, how they maintained their humanity and their dignity in the face of forces that seemed to be arrayed against them. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand fully the impact and the full tragedy of these livestock disease crises, to comprehend with real depth the scope of the disaster that befell farming communities and farming families throughout Europe and North America, we must first understand the world of farming as it existed before the diseases struck, must understand the nature of farming communities and farming families, and the deep and multifaceted, Connections that tied people to their land and to their animals, connections that went far beyond mere economic relationships or financial transactions. Farming has always been central to human civilization and to human survival. For thousands of years, stretching back to the beginning of agriculture itself, perhaps 10,000 years ago, before industrialization, before urbanization, before the development of modern technology and modern economies and modern cities, the vast majority of human beings were farmers or were directly dependent on farmers for their food and their survival. Humans across the world were connected to the land, were dependent on the productivity of crops and livestock for survival, were subject to and embedded within the rhythms of the agricultural year and to the daily demands of caring for animals and cultivating plants. The relationship between human and animal, between human and land, was fundamental to human survival and to human identity. Even today, in the developed nations of Europe and North America, where only a tiny percentage of the population is directly engaged in agriculture, where most people obtain their food from supermarkets without any awareness of where it came from or how it was produced, farming remains culturally and economically important, remains symbolically significant as a representation of connection to nature and to traditional ways of life and to heritage and to continuity. Yet the scale and nature of farming has changed dramatically in the decades and centuries leading up to the disease crises of the early 2000s. Industrial agriculture, with its emphasis on efficiency and production at scale, and on the application of technological solutions to agricultural problems, had increasingly replaced the small-scale family farming of earlier eras. Yet in many regions, particularly in rural areas in Britain and throughout Europe and North America, farms remained family operations business enterprises that had been passed down through generations that represented accumulated knowledge and expertise and investment spanning decades or even centuries, sometimes representing continuous occupation of the same land by the same family for hundreds of years, with the same fields being cultivated and the same animals being herded for generations upon generations. The typical farmer in the late 20th century in the years immediately before the disease crisis struck was often someone who had grown up on a farm, who had learned farming practices and farming wisdom from their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who had inherited the farm and was raising their own children on the same land, following the same patterns and rhythms and routines that had characterized farming in that place for generations. These farmers had deep and intimate knowledge of their land, acquired through years and decades of observation and work. They knew the soil in detail, knew how it drained after rain, knew which areas became waterlogged and which dried out quickly, knew the color and texture and composition of the soil in different areas of their land. They knew which areas were best for different crops or different animals, knew where the good grazing was and where the poor grazing was, knew the topography and the elevation changes and how these affected drainage and growing conditions. They knew the weather patterns and seasonal cycles that governed agricultural work in that place, understood the microclimate of their particular location and how it differed from neighboring areas. They could predict when frost would come and when the growing season would end. They understood which crops could be grown successfully in their location and which could not. They had developed real relationships with their animals, not in a sentimental or anthropomorphic way, but in a practical way based on years of close observation and daily interaction. They understood individual animals, recognizing them by sight and by sound, knowing their temperaments and their productive capabilities, knowing which cows were good mothers and which were not, knowing which sheep were prone to illness and which were hardy and healthy, knowing the personality quirks and the individual behaviors of the creatures they cared for. The animals were not just economic assets, though they were that, not just production units generating milk or meat or wool, though they were that too, but they were also companions of a sort, creatures that the farmer had raised from birth, that had been part of the farm for years or even decades, creatures that the farmer knew intimately and that responded to the farmer's presence and care and attention. Farming communities were tight-knit and were built on cooperative relationships and mutual support. Farmers would help each other with harvests or with other major tasks that required more labor than a single family could provide. In the time before modern machinery and before industrialization, a harvest required many hands, and farmers would work together, moving from farm to bring in the crops. Knowledge about farming practices was shared informally through conversation and through demonstration and through the teaching of younger generations. When a farmer faced a problem, a disease in his herd, or a crop failure, or an equipment problem, he could turn to his neighbors and to the community for advice and for help. Rural villages often consisted primarily of farmers and their families, along with the supporting services and businesses that farming required. There were agricultural suppliers who sold seeds and fertilizers and feed and equipment. There were machinery dealers who maintained and repaired farm equipment. There were feed mills that processed grain and produced feed for livestock. There were veterinarians who provided medical care for animals. There were slaughterhouses that processed animals for meat. There were various other services and trades that depended on farmers for their customers, and that depended on farming for their economic viability. The entire social and economic structure of rural communities was built around agriculture and depended fundamentally on the health and the productivity of farms, was organized around the rhythms of the farming year, around crop planting and crop growth and crop harvesting and animal husbandry and animal reproduction and the constant cycle of caring for living things. These communities had their own identity and culture distinct from urban areas, their own values and traditions, their own understanding of what it meant to be a farmer and to live a farmer's life, their own sense of pride in agricultural work and in the continuity of farming tradition, their own sense of connection to the land and to nature. The work of farming was hard and physically demanding and required much from those who undertook it, required early mornings and long days and work in all weather conditions and constant attention to the needs of animals and crops. Yet it also offered rewards and satisfactions that were difficult to find in other occupations, satisfactions that were deeply meaningful to farmers and that helped them endure the hardships and the challenges. To manage a living thing, to have responsibility for a creature's welfare and survival, to care for animals and to see them thrive, to provide them with food and shelter and veterinary care when they became ill, to see calves born or lambs or piglets come into the world, to witness the growth and development of creatures under one's care, to see animals mature, and to understand their individual development and their individual characters, these were deeply satisfying experiences for many farmers, experiences that provided a sense of meaning and purpose and connection. There was a sense of meaningful engagement with natural processes, with the cycles of life and death and reproduction that characterize all living things, with the fundamental processes that govern existence. There was satisfaction in the tangible nature of the work. You could see and feel the results of your labor in the animals themselves, in their health and their condition, in the way they looked and moved and behaved, in the tangible evidence of their well-being or their suffering. There was a sense of stewardship of responsibility toward creatures that depended on the farmer for their survival and their welfare, of being part of a chain of care that stretched back to farmers who had worked the same land in earlier generations, and that would extend forward to farmers who would work the land in future generations. The relationship between a farmer and his or her animals was often characterized by genuine affection and concern, sometimes by love, even if that love was not always expressed openly because of the cultural norms of farming communities that discouraged overt expressions of emotion or sentimentality. Farmers took pride in their animals, in maintaining their health and their well-being, in breeding selectively for desirable characteristics, in keeping detailed records of genetics and lineage, in understanding the bloodlines and the hereditary traits that had been built up over decades of selective breeding. While modern industrial farming sometimes seems to treat animals as mere production units, as biological machines for converting feed into meat or milk. Many traditional farmers retained something of the older relationship with animals, seeing them as individuals worthy of care and concern, as creatures with their own personalities and their own needs and their own capacity to suffer or to be content. A dairy farmer might name his cows and know each one individually, would know her milk production and her temperament, would recognize her by sight, and would know immediately if something was wrong with her, if she was sick or injured or distressed. A sheep farmer might spend hours walking through his flock, understanding the social dynamics within the flock, understanding which sheep were dominant and which were submissive, ensuring that all the animals were healthy and content, watching for signs of disease or predation or injury. A pig farmer might observe the behavior of his pigs in detail, understanding their social relationships, watching mother pigs with their piglets, learning what made them content or distressed. The animals provided the farmer with a livelihood, yes, provided income and provided food for the farmer as family, and provided the economic foundation for the farm as continued existence. But they also provided companionship and a sense of purpose and a sense of connection to natural processes and to the cycles of life. The farmer understood himself as a caretaker of animals, as someone whose role was to ensure their welfare and their survival. It was into this world, a world that seemed stable, and that had existed in various forms for centuries, that had been passed down from generation to generation, with gradual adaptations and improvements, but with fundamental continuity of purpose and practice, a world where farming was not just an economic activity, but was a way of life and a source of identity and meaning. That livestock disease crises emerged suddenly and catastrophically in the years around 2000 and in the first few years of the 21st century. The first major crisis that reached widespread public consciousness and that had enormous consequences for farming communities was bovine spongiform encephalopathy, commonly known as mad cow disease, which had actually been identified in cattle in Britain as early as 1986, but did not become widely known or considered to be a major public health threat until the mid-1990s, when it became clear that the disease could be transmitted to human beings through the consumption of contaminated beef, causing a fatal human disease called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The crisis in Britain resulted in the destruction of millions of cattle, all suspected of potentially carrying the disease or of being at risk of carrying the disease, a massive culling program that devastated British agriculture and that shook the confidence of consumers throughout Europe and the world in the safety of beef and in the safety of the agricultural system itself. Farmers found that cattle they had raised for years, cattle that had never shown any sign of disease, were suddenly considered to be potential vectors of disease and potential threats to human health. These cattle were required to be destroyed by government order. The entire structure of cattle farming in Britain was disrupted and was transformed by the need to prevent disease spread and to protect human health. But mad cow disease was only the beginning of what would become a period of ongoing crisis and ongoing disruption and ongoing trauma for farming communities throughout Europe and North America. In 2001, foot-and-mouth disease, a highly contagious viral disease affecting cattle, sheep, and pigs, broke out in the United Kingdom and spread rapidly to other parts of Europe and to other countries around the world. Foot-and-mouth is not typically fatal to the animals that contract it, does not usually cause massive animal death in the way that some diseases do, but it causes severe economic losses because infected animals cannot be profitably sold or used for production, because the disease leaves animals weakened and unable to produce milk or grow as quickly as healthy animals, because markets close to prevent disease spread, because trade in animals and animal products is stopped to try to contain the disease. The disease spreads extremely rapidly and can be transmitted between farms through contact with infected animals, through contaminated feed or equipment, through contaminated vehicles and clothing, even through the air over short distances. To control the disease-infected animals must be destroyed, and because the disease spreads so easily, and because it is so contagious, and because the economic and health consequences of allowing the disease to spread widely are so severe, preventive culling of animals in surrounding areas is typically carried out even if those animals show no signs of disease, even if they are not yet infected, as a way to create a buffer zone around infected areas and to prevent further spread of the disease to other farms and other regions. A foot-and-mouth outbreak in 2001 resulted in the slaughter of approximately 6 million sheep and cattle in the United Kingdom alone, with additional animals being culled in other European countries where the disease spread. The scale of the culling was unprecedented in modern times, was almost unimaginable in its scope and in its implications. Imagine 6 million animals being killed, their bodies disposed of, their genetic lines ended forever, their futures erased. For perspective, this represented a significant percentage of the total livestock population in Britain, represented years, and decades of genetic improvement and selective breeding being eliminated, represented the economic investment of thousands of farmers being destroyed. The scale was so enormous that ordinary slaughterhouses could not handle the volume that the normal infrastructure for processing livestock was completely inadequate for the task that farmers had to kill their own animals, often on their farms, often with inadequate facilities and inadequate training, and often with tremendous emotional distress. Mass burial pits were created in the countryside to dispose of the enormous number of animal carcasses. Funeral pyres of animal carcasses were lit in the countryside. Smoke from burning animal bodies drifted across the British landscape for weeks and months. The landscape itself seemed transformed by the sheer scale of death and disposal, seemed contaminated and cursed by the volume of killing that was taking place. The impact on farming communities was catastrophic and was almost beyond the capacity of people to process or to cope with emotionally or psychologically. Farmers found themselves required by government order to kill their animals. They had spent years or decades raising animals that represented their economic livelihood and their future animals, that they often cared for deeply and had genuine affection for. The government officials who arrived at farms with culling orders often seemed to the farmers to understand nothing of what they were asking farmers to do, seemed to understand nothing of the relationships between farmers and their animals, seemed to understand nothing of the significance of what was being destroyed. The psychological impact was enormous and was largely not recognized or acknowledged at the time by policymakers or by media. While the media focused on the disease itself and on the government's response and on the economic costs to the nation and on the disruption to trade and commerce and on the impact on exports, the personal trauma experienced by individual farmers largely went unacknowledged, was not discussed in mainstream media in any meaningful way, was not addressed in government policy beyond the provision of economic compensation. That was often inadequate. Farmers had been raised in a culture that valued stoicism and self-reliance, that did not encourage the expression of emotion, that emphasized endurance and acceptance of hardship, and acceptance of the ways of nature and the risks of farming. Yet the requirement to kill their own animals, to participate in the destruction of everything they had worked for, to witness the deaths of creatures they cared for, was almost unbearable for many. Some farmers became deeply depressed, withdrawing from social contact and from participation in community life. Some became angry and bitter, feeling that the government had betrayed them, that the crisis was not their fault, but that they were the ones being forced to bear the cost of the crisis. Some took their own lives. The agricultural suicide rate increased during this period, increased noticeably during the foot-and-mouth outbreak particularly. Farmers who had defined their entire identity around farming, who could not imagine any life other than farming, who had given their entire lives to farming and to caring for their animals, found themselves unable to cope with the loss of their herds and flocks, found themselves unable to cope with the knowledge that they had been forced to kill animals they cared for, found the psychological weight of what had happened to be unbearable. The aftermath of the mass culling was devastating and fundamentally altered the character of farming in affected regions for years to come. Farms that had been in continuous operation for generations suddenly had no animals. Farmers who were experienced and knowledgeable in animal husbandry, who had spent decades learning how to care for animals and how to manage livestock, suddenly found themselves without animals to tend, without work, without purpose. The daily rhythms of farm life disappeared. The early morning routine of going to the barn to feed and milk cattle, the hours spent walking the fields checking on sheep to ensure that they were healthy and not injured or ill. The constant awareness of animal needs and animal welfare and animal behavior, the sense of routine and of purpose that characterized the farmers. All of this disappeared suddenly. Farmers found themselves with vast facilities designed for animals that no longer existed. Barns that had been filled with livestock now stood empty, echoing with absence. Milking parlors designed for dozens or hundreds of cattle, with elaborate equipment for milking and cooling and storing milk, sat unused and seemed to mock the farmer with reminders of what had been lost. Feed storage areas that had been essential and bustling parts of the farm operation were no longer needed, and the feed that had been stored gradually deteriorated and had to be disposed of. Water systems designed to provide water to animals no longer served any purpose. The entire infrastructure of the farm, everything that had been built or purchased with the assumption that animals would be present, suddenly seemed wasteful and seemed to represent invested capital that was now sitting idle. The economic impact was equally severe and was in many ways more immediately catastrophic than the emotional impact. Farmers had borrowed money to purchase livestock, to improve facilities, to purchase feed and equipment, to invest in infrastructure and in the business of farming. They had taken on debt with the assumption that the income that would come from selling milk or meat or wool or eggs would be sufficient to service that debt, would generate enough profit to justify the investment. The income that would have come from selling milk from dairy cattle, or meat from beef, cattle, or sheep or pigs, or wool from sheep, or eggs from chickens, disappeared suddenly when the animals were culled. Loans that had been taken out with the assumption that income would continue had to be repaid, but without the income that was supposed to service those loans. Banks that had made loans against the value of the animals suddenly found that the assets that had secured the loans were gone, had been destroyed by government order, and the farmers who owed the loans had no way to generate income to repay them. Many farmers faced bankruptcy. Farms that had been profitable or at least economically viable suddenly became unable to generate income. Without income from livestock production, and without the ability to quickly establish alternative enterprises, many farms could not cover their operating costs. Farmers had to sell land to pay debts, had to downsize operations, had to find alternative forms of income. Some farmers tried to rebuild their herds gradually, but rebuilding took years. It took time to save enough money to purchase new animals. It took time to secure financing when banks were nervous about lending to farmers after experiencing losses from the disease crisis. And it took time to establish animals in a new herd and to have them reach productive age. By the time they could rebuild, market conditions had often changed, feed prices had risen, and the farm was no longer in the same economic position it had been before the crisis. Some farms never recovered, were simply abandoned, or were converted to other uses. Beyond the individual farm level, entire rural communities were affected and were disrupted by the disease crisis in ways that had cascading effects throughout rural society. Slaughterhouses that had depended on a steady stream of animals suddenly had no animals to process and had to lay off workers or shut down entirely. Feed mills that had supplied farmers with feed suddenly had no customers and had to reduce operations or shut down. Machinery dealers who had sold equipment to farmers and who had serviced and repaired farm equipment suddenly saw demand drop dramatically. As farmers stopped investing in their farms and stopped purchasing new equipment. Rural communities that had centered around agriculture and that had been economically dependent on farming suddenly found themselves economically devastated. The workers who had been employed in slaughterhouses or in feed mills or in other agricultural services found themselves unemployed. Rural schools saw declining enrollment as farming families sold their land and moved away in search of work elsewhere as young people from farming families decided that there was no future in farming and moved to cities to pursue other careers. Rural towns that had been centers of agricultural commerce and agricultural activity saw businesses close as their customers disappeared or as customers' economic situations deteriorated. The whole social and economic structure of rural communities that had been built around agriculture was undermined and was threatened with collapse. The psychological and social impact on rural communities was profound and was not easily reversible. Rural communities in the developed world were already under stress in the decades before the disease crisis as agricultural consolidation and industrialization continued to reduce the number of farms, and as agricultural employment continued to decline, and as young people increasingly left rural areas in search of opportunities in cities. But the disease crisis accelerated this process dramatically. Young people who might have considered taking over their parents' farms decided that farming was too risky, that the investment required was too great, that the vulnerability of farms to disease and to government culling programs was too great, and they pursued other careers in cities instead. Communities that had strong identities built around farming found those identities threatened as farming became less viable as a way of life and as fewer people in the community engaged in farming. The culture and traditions that had defined rural communities for centuries, the knowledge about farming and animal husbandry that had been passed down from generation to generation, the skills and the expertise that had been accumulated over centuries, found themselves under existential threat. The rate of farm closures increased. The population of farming regions continued to decline. The economic vibrancy of rural areas continued to deteriorate. In some regions, entire villages seemed to be dying as people moved away and as farms closed down. The social fabric of rural communities was torn apart by the crisis. Yet despite this devastation, despite the trauma and the loss and the economic crisis, many farmers did not give up entirely. Some managed to rebuild their herds and flocks gradually, painfully slowly, over years or even decades, managing to restore some of what had been lost, even if the genetic lines that had been eliminated could never be fully restored. Some diversified their farms, adding new enterprises to supplement or replace the income lost from livestock, adding crop production or adding value-added enterprises like on-farm processing or direct sales or agritourism. Some turned their barns and facilities toward other purposes. Some converted barns into residential spaces or commercial spaces. Some used their land for new crops or new agricultural enterprises. Some developed wind power or solar power on their land. Some farmers found themselves able to use the crisis as an opportunity, as a difficult and painful opportunity, to try new approaches that they might have wanted to try, but had never found the courage or the resources to undertake. Some farmers began to specialize in organic production, or in direct-to-consumer sales, or in heritage breed production, finding new markets that valued the connection to small-scale family farming, or that valued the quality of products produced on small-scale farms. Some farmers found themselves able to use the crisis to make changes to their farming practices that they believed were more ethical or more sustainable. Some farmers became involved in agricultural advocacy and agricultural reform, using their experience with the disease crisis to argue for changes in how agriculture is regulated and how farming is practiced. The disease crisis also affected different types of farming differently, created different challenges and different opportunities for different agricultural sectors. Dairy farmers, for example, found themselves particularly hard hit by foot-and-mouth disease because dairy animals that are infected with foot and mouth have to be culled, have to be removed from the production system because infected animals cannot be used for milk production and pose a risk of spreading disease to other animals. Dairy farming depends fundamentally on continuous milk production from a healthy herd. The income from dairy farming comes from the daily production of milk, and if the herd is lost, then daily income stops immediately. A dairy farmer might have had a herd that had been selected and improved over many decades or even centuries, with animals known for their milk production and their genetic characteristics, with animals that were optimized for production on particular farms in particular locations. The loss of that herd meant not just the loss of current income, but the loss of years of genetic improvement and selective breeding, the loss of investment in animal genetics and animal development. Rebuilding a dairy herd after loss takes many years because cows do not reach productive age until they are several years old, and because rebuilding genetic lines takes time. During the years when the herd is being rebuilt, the farmer has no dairy income. It still has to pay off debts that were incurred when the herd existed. The financial burden on dairy farmers was particularly severe. Sheep farmers faced their own particular challenges and their own particular trauma. Sheep farming in some regions, particularly in upland areas in Britain and in other parts of Europe, had been practiced essentially unchanged for many centuries, with practices and knowledge being passed down from generation to generation, with flocks being adapted to local conditions and local environments over many generations. Sheep farming is less capital intensive than dairy farming and can be done on marginal land that is not suitable for other agricultural purposes or for crops. Sheep farming communities had developed particular cultures and particular ways of life around the care of sheep. Sheep farmers often had relationships with their flocks that were deeply personal and deeply rooted in cultural tradition and in family history. The loss of a sheep flock through culling was not just an economic loss, but was a cultural loss, a loss of tradition and identity and way of life, a loss of the knowledge and the expertise and the particular relationship to land and animals that had characterized that farmer's family for generations. For some sheep farmers, the culling of their flocks was experienced as a kind of erasure, a deliberate destruction of something that had been built up over centuries and that carried deep cultural meaning. The loss of sheep farming families and sheep farming communities meant the loss of a way of life and a way of understanding the world that had existed for centuries. The avian flu crisis that emerged in the early 2000s, and that continued throughout subsequent decades, created similar devastation in the poultry industry, although it took forms somewhat different from the foot-and-mouth crisis. When avian flu is detected in a poultry facility, entire flocks must be culled to prevent spread of the disease. Avian flu is a disease that can be transmitted to human beings, and that can be fatal to humans. So there is urgency to contain and eliminate the disease. Poultry operations can be very large. Some facilities house hundreds of thousands or even millions of birds in single facilities. The culling of such large flocks creates enormous disposal challenges and creates enormous economic losses. Poultry farmers who had invested millions in facilities and equipment and breeding programs found themselves required to destroy everything and start over. The economic impact on poultry farmers was therefore particularly severe. But because poultry operations tend to be more industrial and more removed from direct farmer-animal relationships, the emotional impact may have been less intense than for sheep farmers or dairy farmers who had more direct personal relationships with their animals. What is particularly tragic about these disease crises is that in many cases, the vast majority of the animals being culled were not actually infected with disease. Prevention culling the killing of animals that are not yet diseased, but that might potentially be exposed to disease or that might potentially become diseased in the future, was the standard response to prevent disease spread. This meant that millions of healthy animals, animals that showed no signs of disease, that were in no way sick or debilitated, that were producing milk or meat or eggs, that were living and that could have continued to live and to be productive, were killed not because they were sick, but because they might become sick, because they might spread disease to other animals, because they posed a theoretical risk of disease transmission. From an epidemiological perspective, from the perspective of disease control specialists, this approach made sense. Preventing disease spread requires preventing contact between potentially infected and uninfected animals, requires eliminating the possibility of disease transmission, even if that possibility is only theoretical. But from the perspective of a farmer who was watching healthy animals that he had raised for years, that he cared for deeply, that were producing well, that were thriving, and that showed no signs of disease, be killed because they might potentially get sick, the approach seemed senseless and wasteful and devastating, seemed like an overreaction, and seemed to represent a failure of the government to find alternative approaches to disease control that might have been less destructive and less harmful to farming communities. The role of government in these disease crises was complex and controversial. Government agencies had to balance the need to protect public health and to prevent disease spread against the devastating impact on individual farmers and on farming communities. The decisions that were made about which animals to call and how quickly to call them and how to prevent disease spread reflected particular choices about how to balance these competing concerns. These choices were not inevitable. Different countries took different approaches to disease control, implemented different policies, had different levels of culling, achieved different outcomes. But in most cases, the approach that was taken prioritized rapid disease elimination over consideration of the impact on farmers. The farmers themselves often felt that their concerns and their losses were not adequately understood or addressed by government officials and policymakers, who often came from non-farming backgrounds and who did not fully understand the emotional and cultural dimensions of farming, or the way that farming communities worked, or the deep investments that farmers had made in their herds and flocks. There was a sense among farmers that they had been treated as collateral damage in a public health crisis, that their well-being and their livelihoods had been sacrificed to protect the general public. Compensation programs were established to reimburse farmers for culled animals, providing monetary payment for each animal that was killed. But the compensation often did not cover the full economic loss, particularly when the loss of future productivity of breeding animals was taken into account, or when the loss of years of genetic improvement and selective breeding was considered, or when the disruption to the farm business and the loss of income during the period of rebuilding was calculated. Farmers also had to account for the loss of the animal's future productivity. A dairy cow that could have produced milk for years was being compensated at her market price at the time of culling, but not at the value of the milk she would have produced over the remainder of her productive life. Breeding animals that represented years of genetic improvement and selective breeding were being compensated at market price, but not at the value of the genetic potential that was being lost. Compensation programs thus typically failed to fully compensate farmers for their losses, and many farmers felt that they had borne the brunt of the crisis, even though they had done nothing wrong, even though their animals had not been sick, even though the crisis was not caused by any failure or negligence on their part. There was a sense of profound injustice among many farmers, a sense that they had been treated unfairly by a government that had the authority to order the killing of their animals, but had not adequately compensated them for their losses or acknowledged the full extent of their suffering. One significant aspect of the disease crisis that deserves more attention and more understanding is the impact on farmers, relationships with their animals, and on farmers' understanding of their role and their purpose as farmers. Before the crises, most farmers had some degree of emotional connection to their animals, some sense that their role was fundamentally to care for and to nurture creatures that depended on them for survival and for welfare. The forced culling of healthy animals, the requirement to participate in the destruction of creatures that were not sick and that had done nothing wrong, that were only being killed as a preventive measure, as a bureaucratic response to theoretical disease risk, fundamentally undermined this sense of purpose and this sense of relationship with animals. Farmers found themselves participating in the destruction of creatures they cared for, creatures that had done nothing to deserve death, creatures that were only being killed as a preventive measure. This created a kind of psychological trauma that went beyond the economic loss, that went beyond the financial impact, that affected how farmers understood themselves and their relationship to farming. Some farmers experienced what might be understood as a kind of moral injury, a wound to their moral sense and their moral understanding of what it is appropriate to do, a deep sense that they had been forced to do something that violated their fundamental values and their fundamental understanding of what it means to be a farmer and a caretaker of animals. Farmers who had previously taken pride in caring for their animals and in treating them well and in maintaining high standards of animal welfare found themselves having to participate in their destruction. The bond of trust between farmer and animal, a bond that had traditionally been central to farming culture and to the farmer's self-understanding, had been broken or damaged. Farmers who had previously defined themselves as caretakers of animals suddenly found themselves cast in the role of executioners, forced by government authority to participate in mass killing. This experience changed fundamentally and permanently how some farmers understood their role and their relationship to farming. For some, it created a kind of alienation from farming itself, a sense that farming was no longer the noble profession of animal husbandry that they had believed it to be, but had become something darker and more troubling, something that could be disrupted by forces beyond the farmer's control, and that could require actions that violated fundamental values and commitments. Some farmers reported that after the experience of culling, they could never look at animals or at farming in quite the same way again. The experience had changed something fundamental in how they understood themselves and their purpose. The disease crisis also raised important and fundamental questions about industrial agriculture and about the nature of farming in the modern era, questions that remain unresolved and that deserve continued examination and discussion. The diseases that struck mad cow disease, foot and mouth disease, avian flu all either originated from or were significantly spread by practices associated with industrial agriculture and with the intensification of agriculture. Mad cow disease, for example, originated from the practice of feeding rendered animal parts, ground-up remains of cattle, and other livestock to cattle, a practice intended to provide protein supplements and to increase feed efficiency, but which violated the cattle as natural herbivorous diet and which allowed a protein misfolding disease to spread through herds. The practice reflected the industrial approach to agriculture, the approach that seeks efficiency and cost reduction above all else, and that treats animals as production units rather than as living creatures, with needs and capabilities and limitations. Foot and mouth disease spread rapidly, partly because of the intensive nature of modern animal agriculture with large numbers of animals housed close together in confined facilities, where disease can spread rapidly from one animal to another, where disease can move through an entire herd or flock within days or even hours. The avian flu outbreaks in industrial poultry operations occurred because of the enormous numbers of birds crowded together in single facilities, creating conditions where disease can spread through entire flocks within hours or days, where a single infected bird can infect hundreds of thousands of other birds in the same facility. The density of birds and the conditions in industrial poultry facilities create ideal conditions for rapid disease spread. The genetic uniformity of birds in industrial operations meant that if one bird is susceptible to a disease, all birds in the facility are likely to be susceptible, that there is no genetic diversity that might provide some resistance to disease. The practice of industrial agriculture, with its emphasis on maximum production and minimum cost, had created conditions where disease could spread rapidly and catastrophically. These disease crises therefore raised questions about whether the industrial model of agriculture, with its emphasis on production and efficiency, and its movement away from traditional small-scale family farming, was sustainable or appropriate or ethical. Some observers argued that the diseases were a direct consequence of industrial agricultural practices that smaller-scale farming operations, with more traditional approaches to animal housing and animal management, would have been less vulnerable to such diseases, that the very conditions that make industrial agriculture efficient and profitable are the same conditions that make disease outbreaks likely and likely to be catastrophic. Others argued that the diseases were inevitable consequences of modern animal husbandry at scale, and that the only way to prevent such diseases was through technological improvements in biosecurity and disease monitoring and prevention, through better surveillance systems and better diagnostic tools and better ways to identify and isolate infected animals before disease can spread widely. These debates about the causes of the diseases and about appropriate responses reflected deeper and more fundamental debates about the future of agriculture and about the kind of agricultural system that society wanted to have. Traditional small-scale family farming, while perhaps less vulnerable to some diseases, is less efficient and produces food at higher cost, requires more labor, produces smaller volumes, and cannot compete economically with industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture, while more efficient and cheaper, and able to produce vast volumes of food to feed growing urban populations, creates conditions where diseases can spread rapidly and has other environmental and social costs. Industrial agriculture often requires the use of antibiotics in animal feed as growth promoters and as disease prevention measures, a practice that has contributed to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that pose threats to human health. Industrial agriculture concentrates large numbers of animals in confined spaces, creating welfare problems for the animals and creating pollution from animal waste. Industrial agriculture has contributed to the loss of small-scale family farms and to the depopulation and economic decline of rural areas. Society has generally chosen to prioritize efficiency and low food costs, which has meant favoring industrial agriculture over traditional farming. But the disease crises raised questions about whether this choice was appropriate and whether the costs of industrial agriculture were being adequately accounted for, and whether society should reconsider this choice. The experience of farmers facing disease crises and massive culling programs also illuminated deeper questions about what farming means and about what role farming plays in human civilization and in human identity and in how people understand their place in the world. For many farmers, particularly those in areas where farming had been a way of life for many generations, where farming had been the foundation of community and culture and identity, farming was not just an economic activity, but was central to identity and to how they understood their place in the world and their purpose and their responsibilities. To lose the ability to farm, to have the animals that were the foundation of their farming operation destroyed by government order, to have the farm that was supposed to be passed down to the next generation suddenly rendered unviable, was to lose something that was central to their sense of self, something that was fundamental to how they understood who they were and what their life meant. This raises deeper and more troubling questions about the vulnerability of rural communities and rural identities in a modern economy that increasingly values efficiency and scale over tradition and local practice. When farming becomes uneconomical or becomes unsafe, when animals must be killed to prevent disease, when the farm that was supposed to be passed down to the next generation no longer seems like a viable proposition, what happens to the people who have defined themselves around farming? How do they adapt? How do they create new identities and new purposes after what had defined them has been destroyed? What happens to rural communities when farming is no longer viable? These questions remain urgent and remain unresolved in many rural areas. For many farmers who experienced the disease crisis, the answer was that they did adapt, that they found new ways to make farming work, or that they found new careers and new purposes outside of farming, though often reluctantly, and with continued longing for the farming life they had lost. Some farmers became advocates for agricultural reform, using their experience with disease crises to argue for changes in how agriculture is regulated, and how farming is practiced, and how disease Responses are determined. Some became involved in efforts to promote local and organic and traditional farming practices, seeking to create an agricultural system that was more resilient and more sustainable, and that valued the welfare of animals more highly. Some became involved in advocacy around animal welfare and around the ethics of farming. Some became educators, teaching people about farming and about the challenges farmers face, using their experience to help others understand what farmers do and why farming matters. Some used their experience to write books or to give talks or to participate in advocacy campaigns. Some simply continued farming in a reduced capacity, combining farming with other economic activities to make ends meet, maintaining some connection to farming, even if full-time farming was no longer economically viable. Some sold their land and left farming entirely, finding new careers and new purposes outside of agriculture. Some retired earlier than they had planned, exhausted by the trauma and the effort of attempting to rebuild after the crisis. The barns that once housed herds and flocks became powerful symbols of the changes that had occurred, became visual reminders of what had been lost. In some cases, farmers chose to keep these barns standing as reminders of the farming that had once occurred there, as monuments to what had been destroyed, as places to remember the animals and the life that had existed there. In other cases, barns were converted to other uses, converted to residential space or storage space, or workshops or art galleries, or were eventually torn down when they became deteriorated and unsafe and no longer served any purpose. But for those who had lived through the experience of culling, the empty barn remained a powerful symbol of loss and of trauma, of something that had been destroyed and that could never quite be fully restored. To walk into an empty barn where thousands of animals once lived, where there were sounds and smells and activity and constant care and attention required, to walk into that now silent space and to remember what had been there, to remember the animals and the life and the purpose that had filled that space, was to confront directly the reality of what had been lost and the permanence of that loss. Some farmers avoided their empty barns entirely, found them too painful to enter. Some spent time in their barns, remembering what had been there. Some eventually demolished their barns, unable to bear the sight of them any longer. The story of farmers with no herds is ultimately a story about how communities and individuals respond to catastrophic change and massive loss, about how people find resilience and strength in the face of circumstances that seemed insurmountable and that threatened to completely destroy everything they had built and everything they had been. It is a story about resilience and adaptation, about people finding ways to continue despite facing circumstances that seemed insurmountable, despite facing loss that seemed total and complete. It is a story about the ways that identity and livelihood are intertwined, about how economic systems depend not just on market mechanisms, but on the commitment and the care and the knowledge of the people who work within them. It is a story about the hidden costs of industrial agriculture and about the vulnerabilities that exist in complex supply chains and in large-scale production systems, about how systems that seem efficient and that seem optimized for productivity can be fragile and can collapse suddenly when disease or other crises occur. Most importantly, it is a story about the relationship between human beings and animals, about how that relationship has been transformed and has been strained by industrial agriculture, about how farming practices and farming systems shape the emotional and moral dimensions of how farmers understand their work, and about what happens when that relationship is violently disrupted by disease and government policy. The farmers who experienced the culling of their herds and flocks learned lessons about the fragility of farming and about the importance of building resilience and adaptability into agricultural systems. They learned what it meant to have everything they had worked for taken away, not because they had failed, but because of circumstances completely beyond their control, not because they had done anything wrong, but because of disease that emerged from industrial agricultural practices and from global trade systems. They learned about the psychological and emotional impact of such trauma, learned how deep the scars of such loss could be, learned how long it took to process such trauma and to move forward. They learned about the power of community and of shared experience in helping people cope with trauma and in helping people rebuild. They learned that some losses can never be fully recovered from, that some things that are destroyed cannot be restored, that some experiences leave permanent marks on the psyche and on the soul. And in surviving it and persisting, despite devastating loss, in finding ways to continue and to adapt in maintaining their humanity and their dignity in the face of circumstances that seemed to make continued existence nearly impossible, they demonstrated the remarkable capacity of human beings to adapt and to persist even in the face of loss that seems total and irreversible, in the face of circumstances that seem to make continued existence nearly impossible. The farmers who lived through these crises carry with them the memory of what was lost and the knowledge of how fragile farming is and how vulnerable people can be to forces beyond their control. Yet they continue, they rebuild, they adapt, they find new purposes and new meanings, and in doing so, they testify to the remarkable resilience and the remarkable capacity for meaning-making and for hope that characterizes human beings even in their darkest and most difficult moments. They stand as witnesses to the costs of industrial agriculture and to the importance of protecting farming communities and farming ways of life from being destroyed by forces beyond their control. Their stories remind us that farming is not just an economic activity, but is central to human civilization and to human identity, that the loss of farming communities and farming traditions has costs that cannot be measured in purely economic terms, and that protecting the viability and the sustainability of agriculture should be a priority for any society that cares about its future and about the well-being of rural communities and rural people.